Hi everyone, I'm Dev.
And I'm Cam.
And you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up.
Do you love listening to the Criminalish podcast? Want to hear more from Kim and Dev? Then consider becoming a subscriber for $2.99 a month. Subscribers will have exclusive access to minisodes, Dev and Cam's live reactions to crime shows and documentaries, as well as early access to any multi-part episodes and so much more. Click the link in the show description if you're interested in subscribing. See y'all in Cell Block C.
So today I will be telling Cam about the case of the Eastburn Family Murders, which took place in 1985. Have you heard of this case before, Cam?
I don't think so, but I have heard a few family murder cases, so it's possible.
Well, this one is definitely going to be a crazy ride, so be sure to strap in. So I want to extend a trigger warning with this case, as we will be talking about sexual assault, which will play a major role in this case, as well as the murder of some very young children. So I want you to be aware of that before continuing to listen to today's episode. And I'm going to be honest that this case is pretty sad and pretty messed up in every way imaginable. So please remember to prioritize your well-being and health as you listen to today's episode. And to help me also get through this case, me and Cam will be introducing a segment where we check in with each other and ask each other what we're drinking. So tonight I'm going to be drinking a red wine, which I believe is called Puglia. It is an Italian wine. I don't speak Italian, so I can't tell you. And I believe it was bottled in Vendemmia in 2001. It's a 2001 wine. It's a red wine. If you go look it up, I think it goes great with salmon. But tonight I will be drinking it on its own. So what are you drinking tonight, friend?
I am drinking the Black Girl Magic Riesling. I think they're based out of California. I don't have the bottle near me, but very easy to pronounce. Black Girl Magic Riesling. I would guess 2021 at the earliest, but it was on sale in the store and it's been sitting in my house for a couple weeks now.
Love that. And for our listeners, we want you guys to get involved in this as well. So please be sure to go to the comment section of this podcast and let us know what you're drinking while you listen to today's episode.
And we'll also say that this is not just limited to alcoholic drinks. So if you're cozying up with a nice warm cup of tea, we want to know too.
So today's story takes place in Fayetteville, North Carolina, near Fort Bragg in 1985. So Fayetteville, North Carolina is known as a military town and is called home by many military families even to this day. And Fort Bragg is a military installation of the United States Army and is one of the largest military installations in the world solely based on population, with around 54,000 military personnel at the base at any given time. And one of the families living near Fort Bragg in 1985 were the Eastburns, comprised of Gary Eastburn, who was a captain in the United States Air Force, Catherine or Katie Eastburn, who was a stay-at-home mother to their three children, Kara Eastburn, who was 5 years old, Aaron Eastburn, who was 3 years old, and Jana Eastburn, who was just shy of turning 2 years old. So Gary and Catherine met in 1970, and they dated for 5 years before getting married in 1975. And in 1979, they had their first child, Kara, and subsequently had Aaron in 1982 and Jana in 1983. And by all accounts, the Eastburns were a loving family, and they all loved each other deeply. And people have said that Gary and Katie just exemplified a loving couple. In early 1985, Gary Eastburn was relocated to Alabama for a 10-week training period with the Air Force. However, Catherine and their children stayed in Fayetteville, North Carolina, because upon completion of the training course, the family was actually scheduled to move to England. So Catherine was taking care of the house and getting it ready for their move out of the country. And Catherine seemed extremely excited about this move, but there was one problem and that was the family had an older dog named Dixie. And they made the decision that Dixie wouldn't be moving to England with them, and they would need to rehome her, which I think is fair because based on my research, if they had planned to move Dixie with them, they would have been required to get her a pet passport. And these long flights can be extremely stressful for dogs, especially when they are larger and they will need to be placed in the cargo hold. Dixie was an English setter, so she definitely would have ended up in the cargo hold for this trip. And with her being an older dog, it would have been extremely stressful for her, and there's a high possibility that she could have injured herself in the traveling kennel or even could have died just because she was too overwhelmed with stress. And something I found really interesting while researching this is you actually have to sign paperwork ensuring that you understand the risk of traveling with your dog and you do not hold the company liable should your dog die in transport. So as a pet parent myself, I kind of fell completely down the rabbit hole with this and definitely feel like I walked away knowing all my options should I choose to move outside of the US with my puppy.
I knew that there were definitely extra fees that came with traveling with a pet. And I know in Europe they have those pet passports. I didn't realize that you had to sign a waiver releasing the company of any culpability if something happened to your pet. Not surprised, but that is wild.
Yeah, because it's actually very common, especially I found specifically when people try to travel from the US to Australia. That's a trip that a lot of dogs just don't make it on, specifically when they are in the cargo hold. If you have a small dog that you can bring on as a carry-on, which you can do, those dogs tend to be fine because you're holding them and you're kind of comforting them the whole time, versus when they're in the cargo hold, they're by the engine, it's dark, it's, a stressful, rattly, scary environment. And you might be on that plane 12, 16, 18 hours. And that's a lot for a dog, especially an older dog. So after weighing all these factors, Gary and Catherine decided that it would be best to rehome their beloved dog, Dixie. So in order to find a suitable home for Dixie, Catherine put an ad in the local paper. So remember, this is 1985. We don't have Craigslist. We don't have Facebook Marketplace. So to post an ad, you needed to put it in the local newspaper and see what you found. So on May 7th, 1985, Catherine received a call from a man named Timothy Hennis who would be able to take Dixie. And later that same day, he came to their home and took Dixie with him. 2 days later, on May 9th, Catherine called Timothy Hennis to check on Dixie and make sure she was adjusting well to her new home. And they had a brief conversation, essentially communicating that Dixie was doing great and adjusting well. On May 10th, 1985, a neighbor of the Eastburns named Jeanette heard a baby continuously crying, and I'm talking all day long crying. Jeanette was aware the Eastburns had a young child at the time, and while the child would cry at times, on this particular day, the child never stopped crying, and Jeanette chose to ignore the screams that day. The following day, on May 11th, Jeanette heard the baby still crying, and she started to notice several things off with the Eastburns' home. The house was completely dark, the newspapers hadn't been picked up in a couple of days, she realized she hadn't seen her neighbors in a couple of days, and Catherine's car was still parked in the driveway and hadn't moved in a couple of days. So overall, she felt like something was really off about the house and something just didn't sit right with her. So after assessing all of this, she called the police to do a welfare check on the Eastburns. So another important note is that May 11th was a Saturday. And every Saturday, Gary would call Catherine and the rest of his family from the base in Alabama just to check on them and talk to his wife. And this was a tradition that they had been doing for years. However, when Gary makes this call, she doesn't answer the phone. He calls one more time and she doesn't answer again. So initially, Gary is thinking she must be busy, but it was very unlike her to not answer this scheduled phone call because typically this was the only time they got to talk during the week. So Gary gave her some time to call him back, but as the hours passed, he became more worried as the day went on, until he too called the Fayetteville, North Carolina police, asking them to check on his wife and children. So after receiving calls from the neighbor Jeanette and from Catherine's husband Gary, later that same day on May 11th, the police did a welfare check and they claimed they didn't hear baby crying and no one answered the door. So they left a note on the front door and left the residence without going inside.
I would think that if Gary was calling them, he would be able to give them permission to search the house. That's usually what limits them, is that they don't have permission to search the house. But I know hindsight is 20/20, but I'm already very disappointed in the police for this case, but I will keep my fingers crossed and continue listening.
This piece really upset me too, because it also sent me down a rabbit hole where I was looking up what are the parameters of a welfare check. If you call the police and ask for a welfare check, what are they actually allowed to do? And essentially what they were supposed to do, which there's also no evidence that they did this, was return to the police station when Catherine didn't answer and ask Gary if they had permission to enter the home. They never did that. They never called Gary back after his initial call. According to Gary, anyways. The following day, May 12th, Gary is continuously calling the Fayetteville police trying to get an update on his wife. And the police department had failed to call him back. And since he had not heard from Catherine, the panic of what could have happened is starting to set in for him. In addition to the calls from Gary, the police received another call from the neighbor, Jeanette, explaining that the baby was still crying uncontrollably in the house. So on May 12th, 1985, a different set of police made their way to the Eastburns' home, and this time they could hear the cries of a baby through the window. And after attempting to knock on the door with no one answering, the police broke through a window and entered the home. Inside, they found 22-month-old Jana Eastburn covered in dirt with a full diaper and a face full of dried tears. And while she was severely dehydrated, she was otherwise unharmed and alive, which is more than can be said for everyone else in the house. Upon entering further into the house, the police found the decomposing bodies of 32-year-old Catherine Eastburn, 5-year-old Kara Eastburn, and 3-year-old Aaron Eastburn. And Jana had been inside that house, roaming around the bodies of her mother and 2 sisters for almost 3 days before anyone found her.
Oh my gosh, so she wasn't even in a crib or anything. She was just wandering around.
Yes. Catherine Eastburn was discovered on the floor beside her bed, half dressed, and it would later be determined that she was sexually assaulted prior to her death. And she was stabbed 15 times and left on the floor. Kara was found under a Star Wars blanket, and she had been stabbed 5 times. And Aaron suffered blunt force trauma to her chest and back. And probably worst of all 3 victims, in addition to their previously discussed injuries, had their throats slit from ear to ear.
That seems personal.
Yeah.
To do that to anybody, but a child especially, as you said in a previous episode, there's a special rung of hell reserved for the people who hurt children.
Absolutely. And I feel that so strongly. There is no redemption for you as a person, in my opinion. None whatsoever. So upon finding this gruesome crime scene, police begin their investigation immediately. However, and this is a point that continues to annoy me, while doing my research, I found that again, the police did not call back Gary and tell him what happened.
You're kidding.
No.
You're telling me the police found this man's wife, 3 children, 2 of them dead, and didn't think to call him back?
And Gary was calling the police station non-stop, trying to get information on what had happened.
And that actually surprises me, because in my mind, the police and the military be best buddies. So I'm very shocked at their negligence on this case.
Oh, and this part's going to really piss you off. He didn't find out about his family's death until the following day.
Oh my, did he find out from them?
He found out from the police, but he found out a full 24 hours after they found the bodies.
I'm glad that he didn't hear it through the grapevine. Because I've heard of cases like that where somebody found out that their loved one died on the news, or because somebody else saw the scene or something like that. And that's just terrible. Oh my gosh. Okay. I already don't like police, but this is not helping their case at all.
I agree with you. And this is why a lot of people just don't trust that the police always do their job. Y'all can't even call a man and tell him that his family's dead? You can't be that busy. I'm sorry. And I'm well aware that every job is busy, every job is stressful, and policing probably more so. But you couldn't call a man and tell him that he just lost basically his entire family.
Yeah.
That's messed up.
There's no excuse for that.
So police have begun their investigation, and upon searching the house, they find that there is no evidence of forced entry into the home, and they begin taking footprints, fingerprints, and hairs from inside the house to later be used for DNA analysis. Now, remembering this is 1985, DNA is a relatively new concept, very much in its infancy, and they were just collecting absolutely everything to hopefully one day use it for DNA comparison. And after completing an autopsy of Catherine's body, DNA was also found under her fingernails as well as inside of her. So as police continue to search the residence, they also found a half-assed attempt at cleaning up the blood from the crime scene, and they discovered that Catherine's credit cards had been stolen, as well as $300 in cash out of her purse.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't enough to take their lives, but you're also going to steal. Okay.
I mean, like you said before with Sharon, if the limit is murder, everything below that seems like a Tuesday.
That's true. That's very true.
So after collecting this initial evidence from the residents, police began to canvass the neighborhood to see who was in the area on the evening of May 9th to the morning of May 10th, due to the police believing that this was the time the murders were committed. And upon talking to some local people, the police had gathered a composite sketch of what they believed their suspect looked like. They were also able to gather that witnesses saw a white Chevy outside of the Eastburn home on the early hours of May 10th. So with this information, the police released the composite sketch and the information of the white Chevy to the media. And the media do its thing and spread the story like wildfire. And one of the people who saw this news report was Dixie's new owner, Timothy Hennis. So Timothy was watching the news one evening with his wife, and while watching TV together, they came across the story of the Eastburn Family Murders. And as he continues to watch the program, he hears that witnesses say they saw a white Chevy in the area, presumably at the time of the murders. And Timothy Hennis just so happened to own and drive a white Chevy. Witnesses also described that they saw a tall white man with blonde hair wearing a members-only jacket. And Timothy was a tall blonde white man. And finally, they showed the composite sketch that witnesses had put together of the individual whom they believed was in the area. And Timothy immediately freaks out because this sketch looks just like him. And Cam, I'm going to send you the side-by-side of Timothy and this sketch right now. And I want to get your thoughts on it.
Oh, yeah, they're twins. Because it looks like he has a beanie on in this, even without him having the blonde hair. The nose, the mouth, the mustache, all of it. The eyes, yeah. That's twin. That's twin them.
If you're curious about what Cam is looking at right now, please be sure to follow us on Instagram at Criminalish Podcast, where we will be posting all the pictures from today's episode.
But yeah, this does look just like him. I would be freaking out too.
So after seeing all this information on the news, Timothy is freaking the hell out because in a lot of ways, he has now become the last person to see the Eastburn family alive, presumably the day that he went to pick up the dog, Dixie. And we do know they had a conversation on May 9th. So we know the family was at least alive the morning of May 9th. So he's freaking the hell out. He's lining up with a lot of these descriptions. He owns a white Chevy. What the hell is going on? So the following day, after seeing this on the news, Timothy actually went to the police station to clear his name. And when Timothy got to the police station, the police kept him and interviewed him for 7 hours, gathering blood, saliva, fingerprints, and any other additional DNA they needed. So before we get any further, let's learn a little bit more about Timothy Hennis. Timothy Bailey Hennis was born on February 24th, 1958, and was a sergeant in the U.S. military in Fort Rock. He grew up in Rochester, Minnesota, and graduated from high school in 1976. At the time of the murders, Timothy was 27 years old and was married to his wife, Angela, and they had their first child together, a 10-week-old little girl. Timothy primarily worked on parachutes for the military and by all accounts seemed to be a nice little happy family. So Timothy and Angela already had a dog, but they decided that they didn't want that dog to be alone and they wanted to get it a friend. So after looking through some ads in the local newspaper, Timothy stumbled across Catherine's ad for somebody to rehome their dog. Timothy called Catherine, and after a short conversation, later that day, he came to their home to take Dixie and bring home his new dog's best friend. And again, spoke to Catherine briefly 2 days after on May 9th. So that is the story of how Timothy became the last person to see or hear the Eastburn family alive and well. So Timothy was nothing but cooperative and forthcoming with all police demands and answered any questions they asked of him without a lawyer present.
I ain't gonna say nothing because I already know y'all know. So I'm not gonna say nothing.
You turned yourself in and you didn't bring representation?
Even if I'm innocent.
I'm bringing representation. Because everything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. So police asked him where he was the evening of May 9th and the morning of May 10th. And Timothy told police that he went and drove his wife and their baby girl to his in-laws' house. And he basically stayed long enough to say hello before driving directly back home, aside from stopping to get gas and fill up his tank. Also, since this is 1985, CCTV footage was not really a thing. So there wasn't really a way for police to confirm his story outside of a receipt maybe for the gas he purchased. But that is the alibi he gave police about his whereabouts. Now, the main witness police chose to spend a lot of time with was a janitor by the name of Patrick. And he was actually the one who provided police with the composite sketch of who he believed he saw in the area between the evening of May 9th and the morning of May 10th. The composite sketch that looked exactly like Timothy.
So the composite sketch really came from one witness?
He provided the majority of the sketch. I guess the best way to say it is his version of the sketch was the most finished. You know what I mean?
So he had the best view of whoever he saw?
Yes. And because his was the most kind of finished, that was the one they were running with. Now, Patrick started his mornings very early, and he told police that around 3:30 a.m. on the morning of May 10th, he saw a tall white man in a black members-only jacket carrying a garbage bag, which he believed came from the Eastburn house. He is also another witness who confirms the presence of the white Chevy near the Eastburn home at the same time. So because police were really relying on the statements of Patrick, they brought Patrick into the police station and put Timothy Hennis into a lineup to see if Patrick would be able to point out the person he saw that night. And when that lineup came out, Patrick immediately picked Timothy out of the lineup without hesitation. But despite this, police didn't really feel like they had enough evidence to hold Timothy any longer. So after he was picked out of that lineup, they allowed Timothy to return home, and they went and got a search warrant for his home. When police searched Timothy's home, they found a black members-only jacket, which had just been picked up from the dry cleaners. Now, if you don't know what a members-only jacket is, it's basically a normal jacket with that material that makes a lot of noise when you touch it.
I know exactly what you're talking about, but I also can't remember what it's called.
Exactly. But the thing that is important about these jackets is they don't need to be dry cleaned. They are made to be washed and taken care of at home. Neighbors also said they saw Timothy pouring lighter fluid into a drum barrel and burning items for over 5 hours, which they thought was very strange because he's never been one to set fires in his home.
Yeah. Now, I will say one thing about the South, people will burn trash. But another thing about the South is your neighbors are nosy.
Correct.
You should just assume they're watching what you're doing.
At all times.
So, Mr. Timothy, you already... I'm going to wait to see what happens. Wait to hear what happens. It's not looking good for him, though.
It's not looking good for old Tim.
And a 10-week-old, too.
A 10-week-old, a baby. A baby.
Mm-hmm.
And police did collect this drum barrel, but it doesn't seem like any evidence was collected off of it. And lastly, Timothy was also short on rent with his landlord, and his landlord was threatening to evict him and his wife and his 10-week-old if Timothy did not come up with the remaining money that was due for rent, which just so happened to be $300.
No.
Which also, just because I love math, is $850 in 2023 money.
That is a good chunk of rent money too to be missing.
That's 75% of my rent.
That's a good chunk of money. Not enough to kill somebody for, but it is a good chunk of money. Not something that can be easily made up.
Correct. And remember how Catherine's credit cards were stolen in addition to the $300 that was also stolen out of her purse?
Mm-hmm.
Police were actually able to track down the ATM where those cards were used after her death. And witnesses say at the time they saw a tall blonde man using the ATM at the times where Catherine's cards were being used. Also, I haven't mentioned this yet, but we know that this isn't Gary because Gary is a shorter, smaller stature, brown-haired man. Most Air Force pilots tap out at about 5'8", so he's not a very tall man. He's average, but he's not very tall. Don't get mad, short kings. We love you too.
Speak for yourself. I'm coming over to the dark side.
It's fun on the dark side, girl. I love me a short king. I do.
It's not though. It's not because men are still men.
Men are still men, but sometimes the short ones know they gotta have more because they're not tall, so they be bringing more to the table.
Yeah, I've yet to see it.
I will also say, I'm 5 feet tall. I'm a small person, so for me, a dude who's 5'4" is great. That's still tall to me.
I'm technically 5'4", but I don't identify with the term short. It just doesn't sit right with me. I think I have a tall personality.
Girl, my personality makes me 8'4". What you mean?
Exactly. That's why I don't identify with the term short. I just don't feel short. That just doesn't register to me.
It's not who you are. It doesn't register with your person.
Exactly.
So after gathering all this evidence, Timothy was charged with 3 counts of first-degree homicide and 1 count of sexual assault and was immediately arrested. And as was custom in the 1980s, police released a grandiose statement talking about the depravity of the person who carried out these murders and that they were 100% sure they had gotten the right man and that they had a witness that puts him at the scene of the crime and they were completely wrecking Timothy's character in the eyes of the media. And I say this was pretty common for the 1980s because I feel like the 1980s, especially with the amount of serial killers that were getting caught at the time, just loved a crazy story, loved to kind of platform and give a voice to these insane people. The media ate that up. And I feel like police started feeding into that and kind of releasing some of these statements. Look at some of the statements that police would release about killers and people they found guilty of crimes in the 1980s. It's brutal. And you didn't hear it from me, but I know for a fact all of them weren't guilty. So, However, after Timothy was arrested, he was actually released on bond because his attorneys argued that there was little, if any, physical evidence to implicate Timothy on the murder charges. He was a sergeant in the Army, after all, and never had a history of violence in any regard. They also challenged the prosecution's eyewitness, Patrick, and further explained that there was no blood samples or DNA or physical evidence that tied Timothy to the crime, and anything that did come out of that testing was inconclusive.
That was going to be my next question, because I know they collected the DNA and they collected the blood and saliva samples from Timothy, and it sounds like that was inconclusive, which what exactly does that mean?
So, in 1985, DNA testing is very much a new thing. And DNA at this time was still being determined based on human opinion. So the DNA would be collected, it would be analyzed, but it would be the role of a person to determine if the DNA was a match or not. Meaning that there is possible flaws with the collection and testing of DNA. In 1985 anyways.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I know DNA, it's usually a certain percentage of a match. And that comes with, there is a 1 in a billion chance that this match is due to random chance or something like that.
Correct. And I'm sure any half-decent defense attorney in 1985 could have easily shown a jury how the science behind DNA is not as foolproof as it is, now in 2023. DNA in 2023 is foolproof. If your DNA is there, you're screwed, homie.
Yeah.
So the defense is putting out all these arguments in pre-trial motions. They have not gotten to trial. And I think the prosecution started feeling the heat of, you're right, we don't have any physical evidence. And they offered Timothy a plea deal, which would have taken the death penalty off the table if he would have pled guilty to 3 first-degree murders. So either way, he was either going to go to jail for the rest of his life or he was going to be killed in prison. Well, I guess he's going to jail for the rest of his life either way. Just a matter of when the end of his life is.
That's very true. So not good options for Timothy.
Not good options for Timothy at all. So Timothy refuses. He said that he wasn't guilty and he was not going to accept a deal that made him say that he was. Now, I don't believe I've said this, but Timothy stated his innocence through this entire process. He never wavered. He never changed his mind. He has always been of the opinion that he didn't do it and that he is 100% innocent.
So he did say that on the 9th, he spoke to Catherine, but he didn't go to the house, and he denies being at the house on the 9th and early on the 10th.
Correct. So upon Timothy's refusal of the plea deal, and despite all the arguments submitted by the defense team in pretrial motions, on May 27th, 1986, almost exactly a year after the murders took place, Timothy goes to trial. And Timothy's father was an executive at IBM at the time, and he hired 2 of the most expensive and well-qualified lawyers he could find to defend Timothy.
Pause. So this man over here is struggling with rent and his daddy an executive at IBM.
Rich. But men's pride is a horrible thing. And I guarantee you that, yeah, his dad was rich, but there was no way he was going to ask him for money.
Yeah. But that does make me think, maybe he wouldn't have, he was like, oh, I'm just going to figure it out myself. But if it was between murder and asking his dad for money, that does make me think he would just be more likely to ask his dad for money, unless he just crazy and just wants to do that. And the money was just an added bonus. But I will sit tight in my seat and wait and hear what happens.
Alrighty, friend. Because now we're getting into the trial. So during the trial, the prosecution focused on the horrific nature of the murders. They spent 2 full days showing graphic and gory photos of the crime scene, as well as all the autopsy photos of all 3 victims. And I found reports that people were weeping and sobbing in the courtroom, and they actually had to remove themselves from the courtroom just due to the graphic nature of all these photographs. So the prosecution spends all this time on the crime scene photos, and it seemed like they were showing these photos to see if they could get a reaction out of Timothy. And Timothy remained very stoic and did not show any emotion when these photos were presented in court, which I think is a damned if you do and damned if you don't kind of situation. Because if he does cry when seeing these photos, do you think he's crying because he's guilty? Do you think he's crying because he's trying to gain self-pity? Do you think he's crying because he's innocent? But if he doesn't cry, he's cold and he's calculated and he's selfish and he doesn't feel anything for these victims. So I really hate when prosecutors specifically try to use the emotions of the defendant when viewing horrific photos to sway guilt or innocence with a jury. because there's no right or wrong way to respond in that moment, because somebody's going to have an opinion, good, bad, or indifferent.
Because people can see the same thing and come away with like a different interpretation of it.
Absolutely. So Timothy doesn't react, and you can guarantee the prosecution makes it a point to emphasize that in their closing argument. So the defense stuck with the argument that they always had, which is that the prosecution had no physical evidence that tied Timothy to the scene of the crime, and that their witness was unreliable. And the defense focuses in on saying that the prosecution wanted to pin this crime on Timothy because it was so horrific that the community had almost pressured the police into finding the person responsible for this crime and holding them accountable. And due to that pressure, police jumped on Timothy Hennis because he was the first available scapegoat. So the jury goes back, and after 10 hours of deliberation, they find 28-year-old Timothy Bailey Hennis guilty on all counts and sentence him to death.
Oh, wow. I honestly don't know how I feel at this point.
And this verdict really split the community because there were some people who truly believed that Timothy was innocent, and there were some people who believed to their core that he was guilty. So while on death row, Timothy receives an anonymous letter, and that letter reads, quote, "Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this. Thanks. Signed, Mr. X." End quote.
Oh, wow. I don't know if I've heard this story before or if I just have heard other stories where somebody has done something similar.
Now, in hindsight, nobody believes that this letter is actually real. Nobody believes that anybody confessed to the crime and he just happened to get this letter while on death row. But the defense used it as part of their documentation to appeal Timothy's conviction. They also added that the jury was pinned against Timothy due to the amount of graphic images they were shown of the victims, basically stating that they had made the jury hate Timothy before Timothy was ever allowed to show his case, and no reasonable jury should have been able to convict him on the information they were given by the prosecution.
Yeah, because there's definitely some doubt there.
Correct. And after all that paperwork was submitted, the appellate court granted Timothy's appeal and his conviction was overturned. In the overturning of his conviction, prosecutors were also told that the amount of crime scene photos and autopsy photos they were allowed to show to the jury would be limited for the second trial. In a jailhouse interview awaiting his second trial, when Timothy was asked if he had committed these murders, he said, quote, "No, I did not kill these people. I have a daughter of my own, and I could not hurt any children at all." End quote. Timothy sat on death row for 2 years while awaiting his second trial, which took place in February of 1989. With the crime scene photos being limited, the prosecution lacked physical evidence to truly solidify Timothy as the one who carried out this crime. But what they did have is Patrick, their star witness who had pointed Timothy out in a lineup and claimed he had saw him clear as day at 3:30 in the morning when Patrick was on the way to work. The defense, on the other hand, focused on poking as many holes as possible in every piece of circumstantial evidence the prosecution had. And when the defense cross-examined Patrick, they questioned his ability to name Timothy as the assailant, given it was 3:30 in the morning, and they tried to paint Patrick as a non-credible witness. When the defense presented their case, they actually got a meteorologist to say that it was extremely foggy the morning of May 10th, and that it would not have been possible for Patrick to have seen Timothy and make a crystal clear identification of him as he had claimed. They also found a pilot who was due to fly his helicopter that morning at 3 o'clock. And the pilot testified that he was not able to fly his helicopter because it was so foggy and it was unsafe to do so. They also focused on a witness who claimed they saw Timothy at the ATM for 3 minutes. They said that 3 minutes at the ATM was way too long to stand there and operate an ATM. And they actually demonstrated this in court, saying that it's ridiculous that he would have stood at an ATM for 3 minutes. Now, this wasn't particularly important, but essentially they were just trying to discredit every single witness the prosecution had. And the defense's final piece of evidence before resting their case, they brought in a man named John. And John lived a few streets away from the Eastburns, owned a members-only jacket, and looked exactly like Timothy.
Wait a damn minute now.
He was tall, he was blonde, he was a white man, he had a similar build, and it was actually normal for him to take walks at 3:30 in the morning around the neighborhood. And Cam, again, I'm going to send you another side-by-side, and I want you to tell me what you think of these two men.
Oh, wow. They could be brothers, if not twins. Yeah, they look very similar.
And it's actually said that when John walked into the courtroom, people gasped because they were convinced that Timothy was entering the courtroom.
If I was John, I would be sick.
Me too, because real life, if I saw those two men from 50 feet away, you couldn't tell me those weren't the same men. That's one person. What do you mean?
Okay, so what happens when they bring John up?
So John testifies that he actually spoke to police the day after the murders. And he handed over his members-only jacket, and they took his DNA, and he did everything else the police asked for, and he never heard from the police again. And with that, the defense rested their case.
I mean, the defense definitely did their job because they've planted enough uncertainty in the jury to make it unlikely that they would hand Timothy a guilty verdict.
And after his second trial, the jury found now 30-year-old Timothy Bailey Hennis not guilty of all charges, and he left the courtroom with his wife and his now 4-year-old daughter hand in hand, hoping to put this terrible past behind them.
Those are such important years, too. It's very sad that he missed those. Well, if he's innocent, it's very sad that he missed those.
Yeah. The formative years are very important. So a month after Timothy's acquittal, Timothy, his wife, and their daughter were paid to appear on A Current Affair, and they did a special where Timothy said, quote, they were out to get somebody, just somebody that they could pin it on and get it off the news, end quote. And when the interviewer responded with, quote, so you didn't do it, end quote, Timothy stated, quote, no, I did not, end quote. If you would like to watch that episode and listen to that interview, we'll be sure to link it in the show notes for you. Following this interview, the Wilmington-based Star News journalist Scott Wisnant wrote a book looking at the Hennis trial called Innocent Victims, which was published in 1993. The book sold over 175,000 copies and was later adopted into a 1996 ABC miniseries called Innocent Victims. And Timothy Hennis was portrayed by John Corbett, who is widely known for his role in Sex and the City. And the book, as well as the series, was very well received, and people kind of walked away from this trial, this book, and the series fully believing in the innocence of Timothy Hennis. And I will say, I watched the series. You can binge it in about 4 hours on Amazon Video, and it's very clearly produced in 1996, so prepare yourself for that. Prepare for topics to be handled horribly. But I found it to be extremely interesting to watch, especially because the series talks about several things that I did not mention as part of this case, simply because I wasn't able to find the evidence to back it up, in all honesty. But it's a TV drama. They definitely took some liberties with fluffing up the story to make it a little bit more dramatic. I don't understand how a triple homicide wasn't dramatic enough for you, but it is what it is, I guess. So essentially, all this coverage after his acquittal gave Timothy his life back.
And I hope he got paid too.
I know he was paid for interviews, subsequent interviews that he did. I do not know if he made any money from the series. So now that it had kind of been proven in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the public that Timothy did not commit this heinous crime, he remained married to his wife, who stood by him through all of his trials, and they would later have a second child together, a baby boy. He rejoined the army and built an outstanding career for himself. He rose up the ranks of the U.S. military, he served in Somalia and Iraq, and he received many medals, awards, and accolades before finally retiring in 2004 with full honors from the U.S. military. And by all accounts, this seemed like the happy ending this man deserved. A military vet who was accused of a horrific crime and went through this terrible experience of being put on death row and had to fight for his freedom. Gary Eastburn and his surviving daughter, Jana Eastburn, would follow through on their relocation to London, and they both attempted to put the pieces of their life back together. But eventually, they did return to the United States, and they still believed with their whole hearts that Timothy Hennis was the one who killed their family. So in 2006, police are going through some of the cold cases in the precinct, and investigators came across the cold case of the Eastburn family murders because Timothy was not convicted in the case, so they were still considered unsolved cold cases. And also in 2006, DNA had come a very long way from 1985, and investigators decided to retest all the DNA from that case. It had been preserved and it was ripe for pickings. And when they tested Timothy's DNA to the DNA found at the crime scene, Timothy's DNA came back 1.2 quadrillion times more likely to be Timothy than any other unknown person.
Wow. This is my thing. Men, they struggle in a lot of areas. But if it's one thing a man knows how to do, it is lie to the point where you start questioning yourself. You're like, wait, I thought I saw this happen, but I guess I didn't. I guess I must be tripping. I must be the one in the wrong. This man done gaslit the whole country.
Absolutely.
Saying he did not murder this family. And they, wow, okay.
Gaslit the entirety of the US of A. So, seemingly police have finally found the evidence that puts Timothy at the scene of the crime. However, double jeopardy is at play. And we've talked about double jeopardy before, and if people don't know, double jeopardy is protected by the Fifth Amendment, and it is a procedural defense, primarily in common law jurisdictions, that prevents an accused person from being tried again on the same or similar charges following an acquittal or a conviction. So now it's looking like Timothy is going to continue getting away with this crime. However, there is one loophole to double jeopardy. You cannot be tried twice in civilian court under the Fifth Amendment. But the Uniform Code of Military Justice permits military personnel tried in civilian court to be court-martialed, meaning they can be tried through the military court system. So they're like, yes, we can try him in military court. However, they run into another problem, which is that this course of action is reserved strictly for active members of the military. And if you remember, Timothy had retired in 2004. It is now 2006. So local police contacted personnel at Fort Bragg and asked them to recall Timothy Hennis back to active duty so that he could be court-martialed. And they agreed.
Oh, so Timothy doesn't know yet that they have tested the DNA and found his DNA at the scene.
He does not know at all. He still thinks he's gaslighting all of America. So on September 26th, 2006, Timothy is recalled to military duty, which he happily accepts because he thinks he's retired with all the honor that he deserves. And he returns to Fort Bragg the following month, in October of 2006. So I'm not quite sure what happened over the course of the next 8 months, but in August of 2007, the commander of the 18th Airborne Corporation ordered that Timothy Hennis be court-martialed on 3 counts of premeditated murder. In December of 2007, Timothy appealed this decision because he stated that the Army lacked jurisdiction, but this petition was denied in April of 2008.
I was just going to comment that these decisions are taking a while. I know the court does move slowly, but seeing it in this perspective really drives home that point.
In May of 2008, Timothy appealed against the court-martial decision at the United States Army Court of Criminal Appeals, and they dismissed it the following month.
And that means that they dismissed his petition, or they dismissed the decision?
They dismissed his petition.
And while this is happening, is he in jail or is he home?
He is being held at the barracks in Fort Bragg, which is essentially the military prison on base. In September of 2008, Timothy appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, and this was also dismissed. In December of 2009, so we're a whole year later, Timothy appealed again against the court-martial at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina. And this was also rejected in March of 2010. So Timothy is submitting appeal after appeal after appeal after appeal and just going one step up every time, and they're all getting denied. So after this final rejection at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, Timothy Hennis' court-martial at Fort Bragg began on March 17th, 2010.
4 years of appeals?
4 years of appeals.
And what does a court-martial entail?
A court-martial is essentially the same as going through a criminal trial that we're aware of. There's a jury, there's a judge, that information. It's just strictly for military personnel. And that's actually why in some cases, depending on the severity of the crime, you can be charged separately for military issues and separately for civilian issues. So let's say you commit a crime and you don't get any time, you don't get any jail time on the civilian side. If you are active military personnel, they can court-martial you and give you time on the military side, even if you didn't have to serve time on the civilian side. So his third trial begins on March 17th of 2010, 25 years after the murders. And during this trial, the prosecution held front and center their most damning piece of evidence being the DNA that now placed Timothy Hennis at the crime scene. However, the defense tried to focus on the other footprints and fingerprints with inconclusive findings. So there was other hairs and fingerprints in the home that did not match Timothy and that did not match any of the victims. And they are completely unaccounted for in this case. So while the defense was trying to focus on the inconclusive findings, it was really hard for the defense to disregard the main DNA evidence because the DNA that matched with Timothy came from inside Catherine.
And was that the only DNA? Was it only the DNA inside of her?
Nowhere I found they talk about the DNA under her fingernails or anything else. They kind of harbored in on they found his semen in her.
I always know how the suspects usually explain that away, so I'm sure I can guess what Timothy's defense was there.
Of course. Timothy disputed this information and claimed that he and Catherine had consensual sex the day that he came to pick up the dog, Dixie. And he had just somehow forgotten to mention this until 25 years after the fact.
And also, he came to pick up that dog on the 7th of May. She was killed either on the 9th or the 10th. Like, yes, sperm can stay in your body for that long, but I don't think they would still find semen after that long of a time.
Exactly. And it's times like these where I hate defense attorneys sometimes. And I know that it's their job to defend their client. It is their job to, ensure that everybody's following the rules and whatever. But his attorney just so grossly and bluntly stated that they had consensual sex. They're adults. Yeah, she was cheating on her husband with my client. He really tried to paint Catherine as this Scarlet who was just sleeping around on her husband. And it was so gross and disrespectful.
Yeah.
And I get that it is your job to defend your client. It is your job to pursue their not guilt with your whole being. But that's just gross. So after 3 hours of deliberation on April 3rd, 2010, the jury found now 55-year-old Timothy Bailey Hennis guilty of all charges, and again, he was sentenced to death.
I didn't realize that the military court can sentence somebody to death. That's really interesting.
Yes, they can. And after this sentence, he was dishonorably discharged and stripped of everything he had obtained post his original acquittal. So Timothy is currently sitting on death row at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Now, there hasn't been a military execution since 1961. The military can sentence you to death, but if they'll really go through with it, who knows? So many believe, myself included, that Timothy will probably spend the rest of his natural life in prison on death row. He has tried to appeal his conviction several times, as recently as January of 2021, and every time it is denied. Gary Eastburn has said he's very happy with his conviction and his sentence, and in an interview after Timothy's conviction, he stated, quote, "I hope none of you feel that I'm gloating over this. I'm not. I just feel like justice has finally been done in this case." End quote. And that is the end of our story, friend. What are your thoughts on this crazy 25-year-long case?
It really took me on a roller coaster. Especially at the beginning, I was like, I don't know if Timothy is guilty. But it just goes to show you how finicky a conviction can be when you only have circumstantial evidence. And you have top-notch lawyers like Timothy's daddy bought for him. One note, I didn't realize like Fayetteville was so close to a military base because I went to school in North Carolina, and of course I'm familiar with Fayetteville from J. Cole's songs and how he talks about it. But I didn't realize that it was so close to a military base. That's just one interesting little factoid that I didn't know. And the most aggravating part about this is he's still proclaiming his innocence. And so because of that, we'll never know why. Or we'll never at least know his reasoning for why.
And I feel like specifically with cases that involve, really young victims, we so desperately want to know why. Because, again, like, what possesses you to do something that messed up to a child?
Do you know if his wife still supported him in the third trial?
I do not.
I wonder what that was like from her perspective.
I do not know for certain, but I do know, just based on photographs and just kind of her presence, that she was supportive of him up until the trial. I cannot confirm if she supported him during and after the trial.
Because, I could definitely understand from her perspective, especially back in the 80s, when it seemed like a wrong place, wrong time kind of situation. And of course, you don't want to even fathom that the person you're married to, the person you love, could do something like that.
The father of your children.
The father of your 10-week-old child.
Yeah, I will say that the more I see cases where wives stand by their husbands in trial, the more I get it. I used to not understand that I'm going to stand beside my man no matter what energy. I just wasn't that kind of girl. But when you truly believe that that person is innocent, and then seemingly the world confirms your reality that he is innocent, I start to understand more why wives stand beside murderers and other terrible people, because they truly believe that they didn't do it, or they're too scared not to.
Yeah. I think too, like, when that person is claiming their innocence, the primary person they're going to be claiming it to is their family and friends. And when part of you already wants to believe that they're innocent, those claims that they're making become a lot easier to hear. I think another part of it too is, especially when there's a lot of direct evidence pointing to the fact that your partner might have did this crime, someone might still be in denial, because when it's a heinous crime like this, they're also thinking, how could I be with somebody like that? I would know. I would have to know. There's no way I could be with somebody like that and not know. And so it's this cognitive dissonance of like, they have to be innocent, because if they're not, then that changes the way that they look at themselves.
I think that's a great point, because it starts to kind of get into that realm of like self-hatred and guilt. And I think about that specifically when you're going through grief, right? And how sometimes you might be, oh, if I had been there, oh, if I had done this, oh, if I had known these things and been able to act accordingly, I would have been able to change the outcome. And like all of that talk is a way to try to control the grief and try to feel like you have more power in the situation than you do. And I could very much see that happening on that same side of like, I'm a good person. I'm good at reading people. I know my husband. I know the father of my child. He would not do this, because if he does do this, what does that say about my understanding of my husband, my understanding of people? Like, I feel like that would just lead to an astronomical amount of self-doubt and deprecation, for sure. So I want to get your thoughts on this. This case reminded me so much of the Casey Anthony trial, mainly because I felt like the prosecution did a very, very poor job in that trial. And I feel like the prosecution relied so heavily on it's the murder of a child. So we can just focus on the murder of the child and how the child did not deserve to be murdered and how horrific the child's murder was. We don't have to prove anything else. We can just make the jury hate you because you're accused of doing something to a child without putting forth any other evidence. And I feel like that's what happened in his first trial, which is why his appeal was granted. Because you can't make a jury hate a defendant and then allow them to convict them based on this hatred. That's not how our system works. Our system is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And though I may hate them, I might hate a person with my full core. But if there is no evidence that they actually did it, it doesn't matter if I hate them. I can't convict them just because I hate them.
Yeah, and I think more specifically, when the prosecution does that, it's not necessarily, oh, we want you to hate Timothy. We want you to hate whoever did this, and we're telling you it's Timothy. And when you put people's minds in that perspective, they need a physical person to put all that hate on. I do agree with the fact that a defense should be able to appeal on this basis, because humans are already so susceptible to different kinds of triggers. I believe this was a civil court, so not necessarily criminal. There was a study where judges were less likely to fully hear a case out and fully give a case their attention if it was closer to lunchtime. And it's not that these judges were consciously thinking, oh, I need to get to lunch, I'm just going to cut this short. But that's how our brains work. We have subconscious processes that go on. And so when you precondition a whole jury like this, it's not surprising that they give a guilty verdict, because they want to find somebody guilty. And if you give them that somebody, more than likely they're going to find them guilty.
I agree. And especially when you have a good defense attorney like Casey Anthony had, they're able to focus on that and almost use it against the prosecution. His name is eluding me right now, but I watched his closing argument. And one of the things he said in his closing argument is, they think that if they can make you hate her, that you will convict her. But I want you to ask yourself, what have they really proven? They have proved she's a bad mother. They have proved that Casey is selfish, but they have not proved that Casey murdered her daughter. And at the end of the day, though I believe Casey is guilty as the day is long, they didn't prove it. Suspicion does not equal guilt.
Exactly. And that hurts the case too, especially when you know that somebody did it. As prosecution, you actually should shy away from that approach, even though it might get you an easier conviction. An easier conviction might mean an easier appeal. Did Timothy ever take the stand in any of the trials, do we know?
I think he took the stand in his second trial.
Why I ask that is because I know that they weren't able to try him again in civilian court. However, if he perjured himself, I wonder if they could have tried him for that. So say they asked, when did you and Catherine ever have a relationship outside of her giving you the dog? And he said no. Well, you at least had sexual contact with her. Even if you're saying it's consensual, you at least had sexual contact. Perjury. I would like to think that if he had, they would have tried it. Although the military court conviction was pretty solid in terms of how long he was sentenced.
It would definitely be interesting. And I only found one place that said he took the stand in his second trial, but they didn't elaborate on that. They just said he took the stand. He said he didn't do it. He got down. Like, that was really it. There wasn't even talk of cross-examination, which I feel like that's always my favorite part of trial. My favorite part of trial is when a defendant takes the stand and he's cross-examined. I don't really care about his direct examination because usually we know their stance. We know what they're gonna say majority of the time. I want to hear the cross-examination. I want to hear the yes, no questions. I want to hear, at what point do you get annoyed? When do you get angry? When do you not want to answer questions anymore? That's what I want to hear. I didn't talk about this, but Jana is now an adult and she feels a lot of survivor's guilt. And one of her biggest questions to Timothy is why he left her alive and killed the rest of her family.
I really feel like it's because he knew she couldn't identify him. Because 3 years old, they can talk enough to give a description, especially if they'd met him before when he came to pick up their dog.
She talks about that in an interview I found, and that was actually the headline of the interview. Why was I left alive?
I could understand the way that she's feeling because almost your entire family was taken away. Family that she never even got the chance to know. She has to rely on photos and other people's memories. And so I'm sure part of her is like, why would you leave me with this pain?
That's completely right. And I always feel extremely bad for survivors of violent crimes because, yes, of course, what was done to this family, what was done to these people was awful and it's terrible. But life is already so difficult living, and to have to live your life carrying this weight of these murders, carrying the weight of why was I left alive? I'll never truly know why I was left alive and my entire family was taken essentially right before my eyes. That's a sad, sad fate. That's a sad, sad way to have to live the rest of your life.
I hope that she and Gary are doing okay as they can be.
I agree. I absolutely wish them the most peace and love in this world, and I hope that this conviction gave you guys some much needed peace and some much needed healing can happen due to this conviction. Any other thoughts, friend?
No other thoughts from me. Thank you for taking me through this story, friend.
You're welcome.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish podcast. And if you are listening on Spotify, Feel free to leave any comments or questions. And lastly, don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Criminalish Podcast, where you can see content related to each of the crimes that we cover. Stay nosy, my friends, and we look forward to talking to you all in our next episode. Bye, everyone.
Bye.